Have you ever bought a house thinking it was just wood and walls? Imagine discovering that beneath the floorboards lies something so carefully hidden. People were paid not to speak of it. The Maddox family's home was never just a home. It was a vault of silence, of guilt, of a forgotten daughter whose name was erased from time itself. I didn't just buy a property. I inherited a responsibility no one should ever carry. And now, I'm opening the door they never could. Because some truths don't stay buried, you can convince yourself of anything when the price is right. And that's exactly what I did the day I signed the papers for Maddox property, a sprawling, time-worn house tucked miles off the last paved road, where cell signal vanished, and the air smelled like pine and old stone. A house that had been on the market for less than a week, and somehow still hadn't attracted a single bid until mine, even though it came with over 10 acres of private land, a barn, and 2 wells, one of which had been sealed decades ago and was only briefly mentioned in the seller's disclosures. And I told myself it was a steal, a fresh start, a way to disappear from the noise of the life I'd left behind in the city, the job I'd burned out of, the people I'd quietly ghosted without so much as a goodbye, and on that long drive into the hills, past bare trees and half-frozen creeks, I kept repeating the same thing in my head. Clean slate, clean slate, clean slate. As if I could manifest peace just by speaking enough times. But peace is a lie when it's built over something left behind. And from a moment I turned onto the long gravel driveway, hemmed in by trees that lean a little too close and seem to absorb sound rather than reflect it. I felt it, not fear, not quite, but something quieter and colder, a sort of absence, like the land itself was holding its breath. And as the house came into view, rising from the hill like a memory no one wanted to remember, I couldn't ignore the shape of it. Too tall, too narrow, with windows that seemed smaller than they should be, all of them shuttered and sealed despite the warm April air. And I told myself it was just old construction, just a style I hadn't gotten used to yet. But even then, something in me knew this house had not been built to welcome. It had been built to contain. And when I stepped out of the truck and my boots hit the gravel, the sound felt too loud, too sharp, and a flock of crows lifted from the trees, as if startled not by my presence, but by the idea of someone coming back here. And the air around me was thick with that particular silence you only get in places where time has started to erode reality. And still, I pressed forward, keys in hand, papers in my bag, heart somewhere between anticipation and a strange kind of dread I hadn't felt in years. And when I unlocked the front door, a heavy thing, painted over so many times it looked like a relic from another century. It resisted at first, as if the house itself wasn't ready to be opened again, and inside, the air was still and cold and dry and smelled of dust, paper, and something I couldn't place, something earthy and metallic and faintly bitter, like old blood or rusted iron, and the hallway stretched out in front of me, wallpaper peeling in vertical sheets, floorboards warped from moisture and time, but nothing was broken, nothing vandalized or ruined, just preserved, like a place someone had left in a hurry but never truly abandoned. And as I walked room to room, flipping light switches that mostly didn't work, brushing cobwebs aside and trying to orient myself, I noticed the strangest thing. The furniture was still there, not covered, not stacked, just sitting where it belonged, like someone had gone out for groceries in 1982 and never returned. And there were books on the shelves, clothes still hanging in closets, plates in the cabinets, a child's jacket draped over the back of a chair in the dining room, and a calendar on the kitchen wall turned to August of a year that had been carefully scratched out with pencil, and I paused there, just staring at it, and I felt that same creeping sense that this house hadn't been lived in. It had been left behind, like an exhibit in a museum no one had the nerve to shut down, and upstairs was no different. Beds neatly made, photographs turned face down on the dressers, the kind of little details that don't happen by accident. And in one of the bedrooms, I found a shoebox on the bed, filled with receipts, handwritten notes, and what looked like pages torn from a ledger, none of them dated, but all referencing installments, balances, and most curiously, containment compliance. And I told myself I'd look at it later, that I had unpacking to do, but deep down I knew this wasn't a house that had been sold by accident, and I wasn't here by chance. And that night, as I lay in a bed I hadn't bought, staring at a ceiling I didn't trust, I heard a sound beneath me, deep and low and steady, not like pipes or settling, but like breathing, and I froze, listening, holding my breath so I could hear it better. And just as subtly as it started, it stopped, and I told myself it was nothing, that old houses make noise, that fear is just the echo of unfamiliarity. But fear is also a signal, and mine was telling me that the Maddox family had not just left this place behind. They had been paid to, and whatever they'd been paid to forget was still here. There's something uniquely unsettling about a town that greets you with smiles, but offers no answers, a place where the storefronts gleam with polished windows and neatly painted signs, but the air around them feels rehearsed, like every conversation is a script being recited from memory just long enough to distract from the silence beneath. And that's exactly what I felt the first morning I drove into Ashford Hollow, the town nearest to the Maddox property, just 20 minutes down winding roads that twisted between skeletal trees and faded road markers. And even before I stepped out of the truck, I could feel it. The way people looked just a beat too long, the way voices dipped when I passed by. And when I pushed open the door to the diner on Main Street and the bell above jingled, the entire room didn't stop, but it hesitated, just slightly, like the air had hiccuped. And I told myself I was imagining it, that small towns always feel like this at first, that newcomers are always watched. But watching isn't the same as weighing, and I was being weighed, measured, assessed not as a stranger, but as a variable. And when I sat at the counter and the waitress approached, a woman in her 50s with a name tag that read Evelyn, she poured my coffee without asking and said, "You're the one who bought the Maddox place?" Not as a question, but as a fact she didn't want confirmed, and I nodded and smiled, asked if she knew them, and she froze for a breath before covering with a practiced shrug, saying they kept to themselves. And when I asked what they were like, she replied, "Quiet folks." And when I asked why they left, she just said, "Folks move on," and every answer was like that, thin, packaged, stripped of detail. And when I pushed a little harder, asking if there was any family left in town, she turned away and said, "People don't really talk about the Maddoxes anymore." And I felt that same breathless tension I'd felt in the house, like something was hanging just out of sight. And I left the diner with more questions than I arrived with, walking the sidewalks in search of someone willing to speak off script. But it was the same everywhere. The grocery clerk, the mechanic, the woman behind the desk at the library. All of them knew who I was before I introduced myself. And none of them wanted to talk about the property. And it wasn't just disinterest. It was fear dressed up as polite disconnection. And when I asked the librarian about old town records, specifically about property boundaries in the Maddox family, she handed me a form to fill out and told me it might take a few weeks to access archive materials, even though I could see the files sitting behind her on a rolling shelf. And when I pressed, she smiled and said, "Some things just take time." And I walked out feeling like I'd been dismissed not by a person but by the town itself, like the entire place had collectively decided that my curiosity was dangerous. And I began to wonder if the silence was new or if it had always been here, humming beneath the surface, waiting for someone like me to come scratching at it again. And that night, when I went to the local bar, the Hollow Tap, I found an older man sitting near the back, sipping something amber from a heavy glass. And when I ordered my drink and sat nearby, I caught him looking at me in the mirror behind the bar, and eventually he turned and said, "Your stay out on the Maddox land." And I nodded, bracing myself for the same shutdown I'd been getting all day. But instead he leaned in a little and said, "You seen the cellar yet?" And my stomach clenched, because I hadn't told anyone about the cellar, not the sealed door, not the breathing sounds, not the cold that sat in the floorboards even during the day. And I asked, "You know what's down there?" And he just laughed. Not a happy sound, but something bitter and tired, and said, "Ain't nothing new, just old rot." And when I pushed again, asked what happened to the Maddox family, he said, "They left just like anyone smart would." And I asked why no one else had ever bought the property, why it sat for so long untouched. And he shrugged and said, "Some places don't want to be lived in. Some places remember things." And when I asked if he was there the year they disappeared, he finished his drink, stood up, and said, "Ask less, listen more," and walked out into the night. And I was left with a taste of fear in my mouth, not because of what he said, but because of how carefully he didn't say it. And I drove home with the windows down, trying to shake the feeling that the deeper I dug, the more the town would resist, and that this wasn't just about a family with secrets, but about a place that had become a graveyard for memory, and that the Maddoxes weren't the only ones who had been paid to keep something buried. There's a difference between a house that's empty and a house that's been abandoned. And in the days after I returned from Ashford Hollow, after I'd exhausted my patience for polite evasion and dead-end records, I began to turn inward toward the house itself, because if the town wasn't going to talk, then maybe the walls would. And so I started with the upstairs, cataloging what had been left behind. Clothes in closets still holding the shape of shoulders long gone. Shoes lined up beneath beds as if awaiting feet that might return. Drawers filled with receipts, scribbled lists, expired coupons. And in one bedroom, smaller than the others, clearly a child's, I found a nightstand with a single drawer jammed shut, and when I finally forced it open, it revealed a battered composition notebook with a cracked spine, its pages warped and curling at the corners, and the name Liddy scrawled on the inside cover in purple crayon, surrounded by looping hearts and stick figures with hair that looked like barbed wire. And I sat down right there on the dusty floor and began to read, flipping through entries that started light. Talk of dolls and favorite foods and drawings of animals with too many legs, and gradually turned darker, more erratic, full of sentences that trailed off and repeated phrases like, Mom said don't open the door, and I can hear it under the house at night. And the further I read, the more I realized the notebook wasn't diary. It was a record, a child's desperate attempt to make sense of something that made no sense at all, and every entry centered around the door and the floor of the hallway closet, the one that hadn't been on the property's blueprint, the one I hadn't been able to open, not because it was locked, but because it had been nailed shut from the outside, with planks so thick and warped I hadn't even realized what they were at first. And when I went downstairs and stood before it, the air around me felt tighter, heavier, as if the house itself was bracing for something, and I traced my fingers along the wood, feeling where the nails had been under the weight of force, desperation or panic. I couldn't tell, and I stood there, hammer in hand, debating whether to pull it all apart or leave it buried. And in that moment I heard it again, the faintest sound, not breath exactly, but movement, shift, like something adjusting to weight or light or the fact that I was listening, and I backed away, not in fear, not exactly, but in deference, like I had entered church uninvited and stepped too close to something sacred or profane, and instead I turned to far into the hall, where another door sat half swollen shut, its paint peeling and hinges rusted, and when I forced it open, it revealed a room that didn't match the others. No bed, no dresser, just a single wooden chair in the center and a light bulb hanging from the ceiling by a frayed cord, and the walls were covered in old newspapers, not for insulation but for concealment, layers and layers of local and national clippings pasted over what looked like marks beneath, and I peeled one edge back and found tally marks, hundreds of them, carved deep into the plaster in uneven rows, and I couldn't tell if they were counting time or loss or something else entirely, but they stretched from floor to ceiling and disappeared, behind more paper, and I didn't peel further, not yet, because something about that room felt untouched for a reason, and I left it as it was and went back downstairs, where I began sorting through the boxes the Maddoxes had left in the front hallway closet, most of them filled with documents, tax forms, utility bills, medical records, all perfectly in order until 1976, when everything just stopped, and it mirrored the timeline in Liddy's notebook, where her entries ceased abruptly after A, frantic series of pages describing the noise in the walls and the way Mommy cries when the lights flicker, and I sat in the living room surrounded by papers in silence, trying to piece together a story that no one wanted told, and it struck me then that this house had not just been left. It had been preserved, locked in time, sealed against intrusion, and for what? To keep something out, or to keep something in. And later that night, as I lay in bed listening again for the sounds beneath me, I realized something had changed. They weren't subtle anymore. They were deliberate, louder, like something shifting closer now that I had touched what wasn't mine to touch. And the air in the room felt colder, not in temperature but in tone, like the walls were watching. And I turned on every light I could find and sat up until dawn, notebook in my lap. And every so often I swore I heard something from behind the sealed hallway door. A knock, a scratch, the echo of a breath not mine. And I knew I couldn't leave it shut forever. Because if the Maddox family had been paid to lock something away, then I had just inherited that responsibility, and the longer I stayed, the louder it was going to get. Money has a way of leaving fingerprints, even when names don't, and after the cellar door and the tally cover walls and the child's diary that ended with a whimper instead of goodbye, I knew that if I couldn't get answers from people, I could get them from paper, because silence in a town like this doesn't just happen. It's bought in what I had in those dusty boxes, those forgotten file folders and yellowed envelopes, was the start of a trail, and I followed it like a thread pulled through time, Each document another knot in a story too tightly bound to unravel cleanly, and it began with tax forms. Years of consistent filings, modest incomes, predictable deductions, until 1976, when the records didn't stop, but they changed, shifted subtly, as if someone else had taken over the numbers, smoothing them, stripping them of identifiers. And that year, a new deposit appeared, listed under supplemental stipend, federal relief, vague enough to blend into any number of public aid programs, but persistent, recurring like clockwork, and I traced it month by month through the Maddox's financials, watched it swell slightly in the summer, then level off again. And it didn't stop when they stopped filing W-2s or paying into local business taxes. It kept coming long after they'd supposedly closed the family. Hardware shop in town, long after their name stopped appearing in any kind of community record. And what was most chilling was how clean it all looked, how carefully managed, how tightly curated, like someone with a checklist had ensured no anomalies would raise flags. And it might have worked, too, if not for the receipts, the handwritten ones, folded between electric bills and old letters, each signed DR or sometimes just R, and referencing things that didn't fit any normal explanation. Winterization complete, cellar reinforced, all four remaining accounted for, no breach since August 12th, and most hauntingly, child continues to deteriorate, no outside contact, and every line was a scream hiding inside civility, and I sat for hours in that dim dining room, the table covered in financial statements and stamped envelopes and bank printouts, cross-referencing them with what few notes I'd pulled from Liddy's notebook, and the overlap was undeniable when her entries turned. Frantic, the payments increased, and when her pages stopped altogether, the payment amount tripled for 6 consecutive months before it turned to baseline. And I knew what it meant, even if I couldn't prove it in court or pin it to a specific agency. It meant they were being paid to keep something hidden, to hold something that should have never been there in the first place. And whatever that something was, it had gotten worse, or more dangerous, or more fragile, because that money wasn't. Silence. It was containment. Hazard pay disguised as assistance. And I found one document buried in the back of a box, a form titled Continuance of Stewardship Responsibility, signed not by either Maddox parent, but by a notary in a neighboring county, authorizing revised control protocols for pre-existing property anomalies. And though the language was sterile, almost scientific, the date was unmistakable, August 13th, 1976, the day after the last frantic line in Liddy's journal, and that's when the pattern clicked. They weren't being helped, they were being managed, and someone else knew it, someone official, someone who had overseen this family's silent suffering and paid them to endure it. And the most horrifying part wasn't just that it happened, it was that it was permitted, documented, structured. And when I looked close at the bank transfers, at the routing numbers and transfer origins, I noticed something even stranger. The account that funded them wasn't federal, not in any traditional sense. It was drawn from a trust labeled ISRO Operatives, and no amount of online digging brought up anything concrete, just vague hints of historical programs tied to environmental safeguarding, unacknowledged materials, and, chillingly, biological custody. And I sat there, fingers trembling, mind racing, because this wasn't about the family anymore. It was about something larger, something sanctioned. And I remember the sealed well, the fenced tree line, the basement door that pulsed with cold even in the afternoon sun. And I knew I was standing in the middle of something that had never been meant for a civilian to inherit. And the sale of the house, the quietness of the listing, the way no one else had even tried to bid. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was transfer intentional, and I was now part of whatever containment program they put in place here decades ago. Unknowingly stepped into the role of keeper, inheritor of a contract one would admit existed. And I read that notary form again, over and over, try to understand how something like this could be hidden in plain sight, how a family could be paid to live beside or above or with something dangerous for so long, and what price it took them in return. And I realized the answer was right there in the silence that followed them out of town. The loss of their daughter, the absence of names in local records, the refusal of the townspeople to speak their memory aloud. And I knew then that the money hadn't saved them. It had only prolonged whatever suffering they had endured. And now it was my turn, my name on the deed, my blood in the pipes, my breath in the walls. And I wondered, not for the first time, what was they been paid to hide, and how long I could live here before I started hearing it speak to me. 2. Some years leave scars so deep they warp the memory around them, and some vanish so completely it's as if they were surgically removed from time itself. And as I sat on the floor of the upstairs hallway, surrounded by the shredded fragments of Liddy's journal and financial records marked with the kind of precision only fear creates, I realized I'd been circling around something no one in Ashford Hollow would name, something no document could explain, something that hadn't just been forgotten, it had been erased, and that something was the year 1976, the year the Maddox family ceased to appear in school rosters, utility, bills, church directories, the year their grocery purchases stopped being recorded, their business closed without announcement, their phone line disconnected for maintenance. And even in the child's journal, the entries leading up to August of that year became erratic, fragmented, full of repetition and dread, until finally, nothing. It wasn't just a loss of writing. It was a rupture, as though something had taken hold of time and twisted it. Because in every record I found afterward, that year was redacted, blurred, or replaced with euphemism. Period of familiar retreat, temporary isolation for spiritual care, confidential, maintenance of home grounds. And I knew those weren't real phrases, not in any organic sense. They were manufactured, planted, and when I took the fragments to the county registrar's office under the pretense of historical interest and asked to view property tax logs from that year, the woman behind the desk, who until then had been cheerful and chatty, suddenly became still, her smile freezing as if she'd rehearsed this moment in nightmares. And she said the archives for 1976 were lost in a flood. But when I asked about any record of such a flood, she said it wasn't reported publicly. And then she stood, excused herself, and never came back, and I left knowing I had touched something raw and buried. And when I drove to the county courthouse, hoping to find old zoning blueprints, the clerk told me that the Maddox parcel had been reclassified that year, and the documents were under restricted access due to prior environmental containment contracts. And those words struck like a match, because I had seen them before in the margins of the notary form, in the footnotes of the bank statements. And now it was clear, 1976 wasn't a year of absence. It was a year of cover-up, and the Maddox family had been at the center of it. Not just victims, not just witnesses, but participants in something they could never speak of again. And that's when I found the film canister in the attic, tucked inside a tea tin marked holiday cards, beneath shredded tinsel and brittle garland. And when I opened it, I found a strip of undeveloped negatives, and I paid out of pocket to have them carefully processed. And when the prints returned, my breath caught, black and white, grainy but unmistakable. The Maddox family, all of them, standing in front of the house. Except the house was different. Windows boarded from the inside, yard overgrown, and behind them, barely visible in the far background, was a figure, blurred, tall, indistinct, standing just beyond the tree line, and in the next frame, they were gone, replaced by a shot of the cellar door, open, and what looked like chains bolted into the ground nearby. And the next was worse, a photo taken inside, from the base of the stairs looking up, capturing the outline of someone or something, curled in the corner, not looking at the camera but away from it, as if trying to hide. And I stared at those images for hours, trying to reconcile them with everything I knew. And I realized that the Maddoxes had been paid to make. People forget not just about the house, but about the year itself. And I began to understand that I hadn't bought a home. I had bought a silence, inherited a contract whose terms were still binding in ways I couldn't yet see. And the deeper I fell into this truth, the more I felt the edges of my own memories start to blur, days slipping out of order, dreams blending into daylight. And sometimes I'd find myself standing in rooms I didn't remember walking into, holding things I didn't remember, picking up, and I started to suspect that 1976 wasn't the only year this had happened, only the first, and that whatever had come to the Maddox land hadn't left, hadn't died, hadn't been resolved. It had simply been recorded, buried, and paid for, and now I was part of it, and no one was coming to explain the terms. You never really know the shape of a place until you walk its edges, until you stop focusing on what stands at the center and start paying attention to what's been pushed to the margins. And after everything I'd uncovered, the shredded ledger, the false payments, the erased year, the photographs that refused to fade from memory, I found myself drawn more and more to the tree line that bordered the northern stretch of the property, where the land rose just enough to obscure what lay beyond, and the air smelled different, sharper, metallic, as if the soil itself had been burned at some point and was still exhaling smoke only I could smell, and on a cold morning that arrived, with no birdsong, I took my boots and jacket and followed the trail I hadn't seen before, one that cut through tall weeds and brambles like something had passed through it recently, not often, but enough to keep the path from closing, and as I moved further into the woods, the temperature dropped, each step quieter than the last, until it felt like the forest was swallowing sound itself, and after maybe 20 minutes of walking, I saw it, a length of rusted chain-link fencing rising from the undergrowth, half collapsed, half swallowed by ivy, but still stretching in both directions as far as I could see, and I followed it, running my hand along the metal, feeling the cold bite through my gloves, and every so often I come across a warning sign, once bright yellow, now faded to white and flaking, with words I could barely read, but which once must have shouted, "Do not enter. Hazardous containment zone. Property of ICR," and there was again those initials, the shadow organization I traced through payments and notary stamps and mysterious trust accounts, and the realization hit me like a punch. This land wasn't just isolated. It had been fenced off on purpose, not to protect the Maddox family from the outside, but to keep something within, and the further I walked, the more signs I found, bones scattered in the leaves, small and animal, but strangely clean, as if they'd been picked rather. Then decayed, trees with bark clawed and vertical lines far too high for any local predator, and scorch marks along the fence line itself, as if fire had burst from the inside out, and I couldn't understand how none of this had been in the listing, how none of it had shown up in the satellite view, and then I realized it must have. Someone had removed it, scrubbed the maps, cleaned the records, sold me a property that was never meant to be sold, and I kept walking, kept searching for a break-in. The fence, and finally I found one, a section where the links had been pulled apart, not cut but bent, like something had forced its way through, and the ground beneath was churned, the soil disturbed, old footprints long since washed away, but the impression still visible, and I stepped through, holding my breath without realizing it, and found myself in a clearing unnaturally round, too perfect, with a tall metal post in the center bearing what looked like a camera housing, long since gutted, the wires hanging like veins. At the base of the pole were more signs, shattered and buried, one of which still had legible text, monitoring suspended by order of ICR. Report all movement anomalies to nearest field officer. And I stared at that word, anomalies, and felt a chill deeper than cold, because anomalies don't live in nature. They're artifact of the unnatural, of errors, of breaches. And someone had lived here, been watched here, escaped from here, and I was now standing where no one had stood in years, perhaps decades, and suddenly I heard it, not a sound, exactly, but an absence, a hush so thick and total that it rang in my ears, and the trees around me, so dense only minutes before, now felt too far, apart, as if someone had stepped between them, behind me, near me, and I turned, slowly, seeing nothing but feeling watched, a sensation so intense my eyes watered, and I backed out of clearing, retraced my steps, hand brushing the fence until I was out of trees, back at the edge of the field. And I didn't speak, didn't breathe deeply, not until a house came back into view, and even then, I didn't feel safe, because I understood now that the forest wasn't outside my home. It was the boundary of a prison, and something inside had broken out, or worse, had never left, and I thought again of the cellar door, of Liddy's journal, of the words she wrote when no one was listening, and I began to wonder if I'd already walked too far, if the contract I'd unknowingly signed had already begun to rewrite the year in which I now live, because I couldn't remember what day it was, or how long it had been since I last left the house. And when I looked at my phone, the time blinked back at me in a frozen loop for 44, again and again, until I powered it off and sat on the porch with my head in my hands, knowing that the forest didn't care about dates or records or documents. It only cared about borders. And I had crossed one that I found him after months of dead ends and rumors, an old man who lived in a secluded cabin 100 miles north, with no online presence, but whose name surfaced in a long-forgotten inspector's ledger, Roger Hawk Ellison, the man who once managed rural containment contracts for an organization that didn't officially exist, the one who signed the checks to the Maddoxes and activated the ICR trust accounts I'd chased through dusty ledgers and encrypted banking forms. And when I finally met him, bundled in a coat that had seen better winters, he invited me inside with a haunted quiet, his cabin smelling of diesel and old coffee, the walls lined with mementos of regulatory days, certificates, faded press photos, a dusty plaque that read excellence in unknown hazards management, an RDA 1974, and there he sat, behind a reclaimed maple desk, unassuming except for the nervous twitch in his left hand, and when I asked him to tell me about that check he sent in August 1976, his eyes flickered away, and he said, "Funny how these things find you." And he paused as if waiting to feel my reaction, then continued in a voice so low I had to lean closer. "They didn't want you looking too close." From the moment I sat down, I sensed that everything in his cabin was a crucible. Each paper pinned to the wall, every folder labeled Project Orwood Confidential, Maddox Relocation Completed, Contain Heritage Site Active. These weren't just files. They were relics of buried truth. And I watched as Roger picked up a photo showing a dusty hard hat stamped with ICR, standing in front of my property in 1976. He sighed and said that the Maddoxes had been chosen because they were trustworthy, that family-run hardware stores didn't ask questions, especially when a well-placed cut could secure a quiet summer, and a hush offered by isolation. No city noise, no neighbors. Made them ideal. The plot, he revealed, was never about people. It was about what the land held, and why that land had never been developed or sold until now. He slid a folder toward me across the table. It's labeled Mass, but dated June 1976. Inside, I found technical surveys, geological readings, and notes describing anomalous resonance beneath basement floor, and unnatural rhythmic signals at 3 a.m. local time. I almost turned the pages backward in incredulity. Words like resonance or harmonic phase didn't belong in real estate. They belonged in conspiracies. When I gestured toward one sheet showing a cross-sectional map with a spiral symbol etched into rock strata below the house, he looked away, thin lines cracking the skin around his eyes, and quietly said, "We didn't always know what it was. Just that it was old, very old, and best left buried." I asked him if the Maddox daughter, Liddy, had seen or heard it. He closed his eyes. Children are sensitive. They feel before they see. She wasn't the same after we paid her parents. Paintings became dark. Her voice hollow. When staff visited, she wouldn't look at them. I looked him in the eyes and asked what was being contained here. Roger's head dipped, and he said, "Something not meant for people, no system, no category." There was so much in that half sentence. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't explaining. I pressed him about Project Orwood, who ordered it and why. He shook his head as if spinning in slow motion. A client. We were ordered to clear and contain the entire land, not just a Maddox home. It was satellite classified. ICR didn't file it publicly. We paid their mortgage for 2 years, gave them regular stipends, ensured they never left. They were quiet. We bought silence. Every word was a hammer pressing down deeper. I asked why they left in 1978. He said a new protocol triggered. They were to abandon the land, allowed to return only after the housing contract was closed. They were told they'd never speak of it. No compensation beyond what was paid. Their silence was worth more than the mortgage. Their compliance was insurance, he said. When I asked what happened to Liddy, he sighed. She saw too much. A family like that could hide a house from the town, but children cannot hide from it, not when it watches. I felt a cold nibble in my chest as I asked, "Was it watching?" He didn't answer. He didn't blink. He only whispered, "Yes." There is a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't come from individuals. It comes from systems, from documents crafted to look benign yet carry the weight of secrets too heavy for any single person to bear. And as I sank deeper into the Maddox Land's paper trail, reviewing deeds and municipal filings late into the night, it became clear that this property was never meant to sell. Not really. And I'm not talking about the few skeptical locals who silently kept the house vacant for decades. I'm talking about protocols established by government mandate in the 1970s that designated this land as restricted, an active containment site protected from the public, and never be transferred out of federal oversight. And yet here I was, deed in hand, standing inside its walls as if everything had been allowed to proceed under normal rules. And the more I dug, the more cracks appeared, subtle clauses buried deep in the chain of title that forced each subsequent buyer to sign non-disclosure. Agreements to waive legal recourse for any matter known or unknown, seen or unseen, and to grant access to IR control parties at any time, unstated obligations held not in the deed text of the average buyer, but in side agreements, banking trust notes, and digital file streams tucked into the notary's archives under multiple patents. And one footnote in a 1992 escrow file suggested that the house had never officially closed, that the Maddox family or their heirs were just listed as grantors on paper while the assets were funneled into a shell company that existed only to hold the property for ecological research. And I realized bitterly that my purchase hadn't been free and clear. It had been directed, permitted, even engineered to the real estate apparatus to land exactly in my lap, the final piece in a chain of custody that had lasted nearly 50 years, waiting for just this moment. And as I reread the closing documents, each signature under my name blurred in my mind. I saw the layers I had walked over, my ignorance, my eager readiness for change, and also the indifference of those I trusted, from the solicitor who warned me not to go poking around, to the agent who cautioned that some houses remember more than others. Details I had chalked up the sales banner, until now I saw them as coded warnings, and whenever I thought I understood one implication, another would emerge. Their due diligence report, which on the surface was clean, itemized the building's age and utilities, but omitted the fence perimeter line documented in municipal maps I later accessed through a county clerk's back channel and hidden in the surveyor's notebook. Hand-scrawled cursorily on page 47 was a note that read, IR containment zone. Extends 200 yards beyond fence. Buyer must be clear with ICR or trust documentation. But it had never been disclosed, and no closure package had ever been issued, and I felt that slash of violation between my ribs sharper than any fear, because someone somewhere deliberately withheld not just the presence of the fence or protocols, but the truth that this land had been removed from common law and treated as a trespassable variable, belonging to no one yet protected by everyone, until now, when the deal had been allowed, giving me keys to a liability centuries in the making, and I replayed the early days I spent cleaning the yard, fixing the shingles, taking pride in the restoration, and realized I had been complicit in the lie. I had helped bring it back to life under the illusion of homeownership, when in truth I was occupying a contact point in some hidden agenda, not of my choosing. And when I tried to contact a real estate broker who closed the deal, her voicemail cut off. As soon as I said Maddox containment clause, and when I called the escrow firm, they declined comment, insisting the files were off the record. And even my bank had nothing to say beyond your loan is secure, which was its own kind of confirmation, and I found myself nearly unable to speak aloud about it. Every time I said the phrase IR control parties, it sounded unreal, like an echo of someone else's nightmare, until I realized that the nightmares had been waiting here for decades, and I had just unlocked their cage, unwittingly paved a path to them with my own signature, and I wondered how many people had been through the transaction, how many unwitting heirs there had been before me, and what had happened to them, because this wasn't the first time containment had transferred hands. It was a quiet conveyor belt, passing property, documentation, legal obligations from one unaware caretaker to the next, and I was not the exception. I was the culmination, the final receiver, expected to guard silence, to honor protocols I'd never read, and I hated the truth of it, hated what it said about trust and property, and how easily some organization, could hide a contract in plain view, distort the law to conceal their containment strategy in the world's real estate ledger. And when I put down the files I pulled apart every weekend, I realized that this wasn't just about hiding something here. It was about controlling who could walk away, and the fact that I had been allowed to was either the greatest error or the cruelest tactic yet, and I needed to know which, because if this was a loss of custody, an unfinished agreement left in limbo, then I had to decide what to do with it, who to contact, how to approach an organization that publicly denied it existed, but privately had managed this property for half a century. And in that reckoning, I finally understood the equation laid out silently by those buried clauses. I was a buyer in good faith, but I was also the last variable in a containment system that had never been revoked, and the boundaries were not just mapped on the fence. They were written into contract, into trust, into everything I thought home would mean, and suddenly I didn't just live here. I had to live here, or risk reigniting something that had not been allowed to die, and all around me silence deepened, as if the walls themselves were reminding me that some deals are never paid in full, when the house settles in, around you, the way the walls seem to close in, the stale air thickens, and every beam groans like a warning. You know you're standing in the presence of history that never wanted to be told. And after tracing property lines, digging through legal loopholes, confronting contractors, and crossing boundaries literal and psychological, I found myself back in that main living room, hammer in hand, standing over the board that covered the hidden hatch, its edges worn almost to the point of invisible, and I paused there, breathing so hard I could see my own chest rise in the dim light of the single lamp I brought, knowing that this was a threshold, the one that would tell me whether all the breadcrumbs left by Liddy, by payments, by containment protocols, led to revelation or ruin. And I pulled the nails first, slow and steady, each extraction a confession, and then I lifted the panel, its underside coated in decades of dust, so thick the air shifted in a soft cloud around me. And I realized breaking that seal was like cracking a coffin, like setting loose 1,000 unspoken stories that the Maddoxes had paid for, whether they'd meant to or not. And as I descended, the temperature dropped instantly, the air grew dense, and the light from my phone flickered from the stairs to the floor, where I found a narrow room no bigger than a closet, but enough to hold something inside its concrete and wood walls. And before me lay personal items scattered across the floor. Toys, melted into strange shapes, sketchbooks soaked through with stains I didn't want to identify, hundreds of VHS tapes without labels, jars of unopened vials with coded numbers etched in felt-tip marker, and at the center, a makeshift shrine. Photos of unknown faces, each face scored out with red marker, pinned to the wall around a child's drawing of a house with its door wide open instead of boarded up. And I realized with a jolt that this was what the Maddoxes had built over silence. Not just a room for containment, but room for mourning, for remembering wrongly, because the names are crossed out, but the images remained in mass beneath them. On the floor were piles of documents, journals like Liddy's but unsigned, filled with guilt, recrimination, fear, and final pleas. Please make them remember. I sank to my knees, hands shaking, chest aching, because I understood this wasn't containment. It was atonement or desperation disguised as obedience. And I looked at the wall again, the faces staring back at me, and I wasn't just in a hidden room, but the center of someone else's grief, someone else's vow to never remain silent. And then I noticed movement, not because it was movement, but because I felt breath in the air, as if someone or something was leaning into the space with me, watching, waiting, and I remembered what Roger Ellison had whispered. It wasn't what lived here. It was what watched, what listened, and that presence was still here, not in flesh, maybe not human, but alive in the architecture of this place, in the veiled ridge of walls, the iron nails in the panel, the sheen of tears on old paperwork. And I understood that every layer above, the plaster, the furniture, the walls and paint, had been laid to smooth over not absence, but obedience, and now it was undone, and I was here to witness it, to speak it, not to bury again. And I pulled out my phone and began photographing everything. The shrine, the toys, the papers, the jars, the faces, the fold in the drawing where a child had traced the door over and over before deciding to leave it open. And I thought about Liddy and what she had written, what she had seen, what she had feared. And I felt both shame and relief, because the silence I'd inherited finally broke. And whatever watched in the darkness didn't stop me. It receded, or maybe welcomed me, I couldn't tell, but it let me stay. And I stayed until my light died, until the room was dark, but I kept listening, and I heard a slow exhale, a sorrow or a release, or maybe the breath of something grateful to finally be named. And I left the room behind me, but carried it in my heartbeat, knowing I could never live here as I had imagined. I was defined by this, tethered to the secret, and obligated to its aftermath. And I stepped onto daylight again, breathless, burdened, irrevocably changed, because the silence was gone. But what remained was the unrelenting responsibility. To speak, to record, to ensure that whatever was contained in that room would never be contained again. That I found Amelia Maddox, now calling herself Claire Rutherford, living in a small lakeside cottage hundreds of miles away, her hair silver and her posture hesitant as she answered the door under a sky so gray it felt like memory pressing down. And when I introduced myself, carefully, gently, mentioning the house on Ashford Hollow Road, her eyes shuddered behind a sudden, familiar pain, as though those years had moved through her blood and shadowed her expression instantly. And when I asked if she remembered the year 1976, Claire closed her eyes and nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in, though every step she took looked like it cost a lifetime of courage. And in her living room, filled with books and potted plants and framed photos of places I didn't know, she sat across from me and asked softly, "Why are you here?" And I told her about the fence, the payments, the enclosure beneath the floorboards, and the people in the house. Real people used to hide something that wasn't theirs to control, and she listened without interrupting, hands clasped tight, her gaze distant but attentive, and after I finished, she exhaled as though carrying me had finally given her permission to let go, and she began telling me what she saw through the eyes of a child, remembering darkness, shifting across her bedroom ceiling like living shapes, hearing voices in her sleep she thought were dreams, and when the payment started, how her parents became quiet, fearful, as though they were reading a script written by someone else, and she described overheard whispers between adults, phrases like site stabilization, containment compliance, never let it cross boundaries, and how Liddy, her sister, had grown frail, her laughter thinning into silence, until one night she disappeared altogether, and no one said her name again, not at dinner, not in church, not when they closed the farm. And Claire asked her parents once, quietly, where did she go? And her mother smiled that worn smile and said, she's safe now. But Claire knew it wasn't true, because safe smells like air and laughter, not rust and iron and hollow voices. And she spoke into the night they left, the hush in the packed boxes, the look on her parents' faces, not relief but defeat, when they drove down that road and didn't look back, and of the trust they'd been given, valued for its discretion, rewarded for compliance, and how it had crushed them fast, like a promise turned to lead. And Claire's voice broke when she admitted that even she believed the story, that someone was helping, that they were part of something bigger, that their hardship was for a purpose, a protection, but in the end she said the opposite found her, that years of paid silence had cost them their daughter, their voice, their home, and she cried as she said, we failed her. We paid them to keep us quiet, and we were the ones who lost everything. And I watched the lines of age deepen on her face, remembered the faces in the hidden shrine beneath the floorboards, and understood that what she carried wasn't just grief, but guilt. The knowledge that the containment she'd aided had been a mistake, a cosmic error that sat under her skin like ash. And as we spoke into the dusk hours, she described how, for decades afterward, she had lived in shadow, never mentioning the property, the well, the fences, because the world she knew didn't have space for error like this, not for adults who had taken money to hide horror. And I asked her if she would help me tell the truth, if she would speak out, and she nodded, tears streaming and voice trembling, saying, but I don't know if the world can listen. And I told her maybe it already was, maybe it had begun, and we sat in that room together, two witnesses to an error that cost a child her life, a family their soul, and a town its innocence, awed by the weight of what had happened, but certain of one thing, that letting go unnamed was its greatest betrayal. And she said softly, then we name it, and in that moment, her tears became resolved, and I felt the story shift, moving between us, tethering itself to our broken admission, and I knew I was no longer alone in this reckoning. I never believed a phrase on a legal document could feel like chains until I found it, buried in a footnote so small it could have, passed as a typo, yet written in language so precise and unyielding it felt engineered to imprison, and it was hidden in plain sight, nested between lines that described easements, right-of-way, septic responsibilities, and yet there was, owner assumes full custodial duty for all contained materials and anomalies beneath structure. Such duty is in perpetuity and not extinguishable without express, written approval from Independent Containment Registry, ICR, or its legal successors. Reading it felt like a door slamming shut behind me, not in a courtroom, but in my bones, because it meant I did not own this house. I paid for the privilege of holding it secret. The only transferable asset was a responsibility, and that responsibility was eternal, haunting. From that moment, everything shifted. The lines I saw on the land, the rust on the fences, the vault on the floorboards, they weren't anomalies anymore. They were covenants, legal instruments disguised as horror, and I had signed my name to them. And around me, the silence grew thick, oppressive, the kind you don't notice until it suffocates you. I sat there on the hardwood floor in the main bedroom, late afternoon sun bowing through the shuttered windows, documents spread around me like fallen petals, each clause mocking me with its civility. In the event of non-compliance, Owner forfeits right to occupancy and must submit to containment audit. Audits. I could feel the weight of bureaucratic cages. Beneath that, another sentence detailed limits on disclosure. Owner may not publish, broadcast, or disseminate any information regarding Site OR76 Maddox or anomalies therein without prior registration and indemnification from ICR. I realized that any attempt to bring this story to light would be a breach of contract. Punishable, enforceable, terrifying. I tried to imagine where the Maddoxes signed. They must have seen this clause, or they'd been told after purchase. But did they understand? Were they told Liddy's screams would be part of the house forever? That their daughter's absence would be sealed in perpetuity under law? It made me want to scream, not for vengeance, but for absolution, for someone, anyone, to recognize how cruel and calculated a contract could be, how it weaponized language and legal rigor to condense memory into compliance. I felt suddenly pinpricked by implication, that even my questions might be considered breach, that voices could be litigated, that the house, the hidden shrine, the fence perimeter, they were not just physical boundaries, but legal ones, etched into the registry, the trust, the very concept of ownership. I thought of Claire, of Roger, of Liddy's diary, and the seals under floor. I thought of the world treating horror with paperwork, and I asked myself, what now? Could I still speak? Could I still bear witness? Was there a way to honor the Maddox daughter without tearing the clause to smoldering fragments? I reached for the contract, fingers trembling, and placed a red pen in my hand. I drew a line to the word perpetuity. I drew a line through custodial duty. I wrote in the margins, they pay to contain her. I pay to set her free. The legal molecules of the clause didn't change, but in that act of defiance, I carved a new covenant inside me, that I would challenge this language with truth, that I would interpret custodial not as jailer, but as guardian. I would hold the secret so others could speak it. And as I rose, papers rustling behind me like stirred ghosts beneath floorboards, I felt the contract's weight press harder, but I pressed back. The clause had power, but only if I let it, and I would not. They say the hardest part of any story is knowing when to stop, but I've learned that some doors don't close at the end. They remain open, unsealed, leaking echoes of the past into every breath of the present. In the weeks since I read the clause, since Claire spoke her truth and rooted my resolve, I've lived inside the house differently. It isn't just wood and nails and paint anymore. It's a ledger of trust and grief, of choices forced by silent terrors, and the hidden lock beneath the floorboards. Now, every creak of the boards beneath my feet is an old voice reminding me that this place doesn't forget. And on the night I decided to speak, to publish, to carry the burden as a statement and an absolution, I returned to that hidden hatch, flashlight steady, heart roaring in my chest, and I realized something I hadn't understood before. The door never sealed because what it contained was never meant to stay buried. Silence was a covenant, but silence wasn't the end. So I knelt there and lifted the hatch one more time, as if awakening the house itself, and stood face to face, not with fear, but with clarity. This place is not mine, never was, but this voice is. So I took the papers from the shrine, the jars, the toys, the faces crossed out but still lingering in memory, and I cataloged them, not to resurrect the past, but to hold the present responsible. I spoke aloud, naming the faces and asking forgiveness. I release you. Slowly, deliberately, I close the hatch. The nails? Not gone. The boards? Not new. But the door didn't seal. Light still blurred beneath its edges. In that moment I understood. Containment isn't about walls and locks. It's about words left unsaid, traumas left undressed. And so the door remains unsealed. So the story stays alive, breathing across these years and these words. And yet, as dawn came to the shuttered windows, I realized that the vulnerability of an unsealed door is also its strength. A sealed door is silent. An open one demands witness. I left the house that morning with the weight of the clause document in my pack, so much heavier than the deed papers, and Claire's hand reached for mine in the driveway. She didn't ask what I'd done next. She just said, "Tell them." And at that moment, I recognized what the clause had buried in layers of legal text and threat. Not the secret, not the door, but the power to choose how it ends. So I wrote, Not under my name or Claire's or the Maddoxes, whose last tenuous threads lie folded in the pages now published, but in solidarity with their child, Liddy, and every voice erased so meticulously. I sent it anonymously to platforms I couldn't refuse, pages developers couldn't delete, journalists who understood how stories outgrow contracts and legal snares. That's when the backlash came. Calls from people who bought into the containment system, emails that rang with rage and fear and denial, lawyers threatening injunctions. But at the same time, messages came from people who felt a tremor in their bones when they read the clause, who remember hearing about a farm that never sold, who had seen the fence in the woods, who knew, even if they couldn't name it, the silent splinter die in the final reckoning. I returned, this time not as a buyer, not as a caretaker, but as a witness. The hatch was still unsealed. The space beneath the floorboards pulsed with quiet expectancy, not for horror, but for testimony. And I whispered again, softly, this is for those who arrived here without understanding. It is for our shared responsibility. It is for absence turned presence. Because I carry that responsibility now, draped in the weight of a clause, but alight with the power of words. They walk through this threshold every time someone reads, shares, refuses to walk away. The house built over silence is now a house pulsating with speech, and the door may never seal, but that is its purpose. To let memory and voice pass freely, to remind us that boundaries may close, but stories, true ones, never shut.